Sowing of the word is commonly assumed to be no more than a pictorial way of referring to preaching and missionary activity. But how can this possibly be so? If this simple parallel is all that was intended, why are we warned so solemnly? And the power to grasp it presupposes access to the mystery of the kingdom. Certainly the writer of St. Matthew's Gospel himself leaves us in no doubt of his convictions, namely that both the springing to life in man, the word of the kingdom, and its embodiment in parable were something to which Jewish history had always been leading up. If, on the other hand, what is pointed to as the sowing of the word is the coming of God himself into nature and man, if what is hidden in this and the other parables and metaphors concerning the kingdom is the turning point of time itself, is the changeover to that directionally creator relation which has already been referred to, then we should expect what we in fact find. We should expect these sayings to be the hardest of all. We should expect them to be connected with man's overcoming of idolatry through the help of an invented or man-made imagery, for that is the first wavering step on the road that leads to final participation. Hey everybody, welcome back to the library. And before we go any further, of course, don't forget to hit like or subscribe because we've got great content coming at you every Sunday here on the channel. And of course, this Sunday, we're back in the library for the Inkling Review. And this month on the Inkling Review, we're looking at Owen Barfield's Saving the Appearances. Now, when I first started this series on the Inklings way back several months ago, I said that Owen Barfield has some of the simplest prose but the most complex ideas. And this book, Saving the Appearances, is where he gives his fullest articulation of the ideas that lay behind his fiction, as well as the rest of his nonfiction as well. And as we begin this, or not begin, but continue this march through some of the major theological works of the writers of the Inklings, we're going to take some time today with maybe the most difficult of the books that we're going to be looking at, Saving the Appearances by Owen Barfield. So again, just like last month with Tolkien's on fairy stories, there's not a story to be told here, but how is the book structured? Well, it's structured it's very well organized as it's trying to trace the idea about what he calls human consciousness, how we perceive the world. And he does this, he starts off with just talking about rainbows, the idea of a rainbow, trying to get us to understand this idea about human consciousness, human perception. If you and I both look at a rainbow, or are we looking at the same rainbow? Is the rainbow even really there? And and he uses this metaphor, or this image. He would probably hate the fact that I just said the word metaphor, but using this image to try and get us to understand the very basics of this concept that he is talking about. But most of the book is tracing what he calls the history of human consciousness, or the evolution of human consciousness. And he says that we started in a place what he called original participation, which is where we, humanity, we saw nature and ourselves together in a unity. So when we looked at an object in nature, we saw it and its meaning completely and utterly. However, what he goes on to say is that starting the scientific revolution, we started to separate ourselves from nature. Their distance started to be created. And while this has some positive attributes in terms of the scientific advances that we have made, he argues that this is a problem in terms of us as for our soul, the health of our souls. And he's not arguing that we should go back to original participation. He's not arguing that at all. And he's very clear that he's not arguing that. But what he is doing by tracing this history is showing how, in a sense, we are emptying out or hollowing out existence. And therefore, we need a different way of interacting with nature and the cosmos. And this is what he argues is final participation. And he argues that whereas as he traced Greek and medieval thought toward the scientific revolution to show how dramatically things changed, he says there is one group of people, in fact, that did this much earlier, and that is the nation of the Jewish people. due to their monotheistic religion, due to their complete rejection of idols, as stated in the commandments, a lot of the way they perceive the world and time had to do with the fact that that objects in nature only had the meaning that they were they were what they were. They weren't anything deeper, because doing so was carving a wooden idol or what have you. So the only so God was the meaning. And what Barfield argues is that the existence of the Jewish people, in fact, was setting the stage for opening up the idea of final participation to all of mankind through the incarnation of the Word, or the coming of Christ. Now, this idea is very complicated. I'm not going to lie to you, it is a tough book to read, but it may be a tough book to read and to understand, but it is a book that is worth trying to read and trying to understand. And especially as he tries to get to the spiritual importance of what he calls final participation, which is where mankind starts to return to a place where the cosmos and nature and mankind are once more unified. But it's no longer because, as an original participation, we looked at an object and we saw its meaning in of itself, not separate from it. It's now because meaning must come within us, come from within us, and we can then see that unified in nature. And this comes from reason, this comes from imagination, but is an active role that mankind must play in order to understand nature and to understand our souls and the salvation which was brought to us through Christ. Now, as I said, though, it is a tough book, but I definitely think it's one that will open up your brain to a different way of thinking. Whether you agree to it or not, it's worth at least taking a look at. So, what are the strengths of this book? As I've already said multiple times, this is a tough book to understand. But the strength of the book is that Barfield really takes the time to really organize this as a argument that builds upon itself. I always like to say Barfield, when I open up this book, or when I read Poetic Diction several years ago, in both cases I open the book and I realize that Owen Barfield is smarter than I can ever hope to be. So you won't be alone in your struggles. This is a book that is tough to get through. But Barfield, because he is so concerned about trying to create a thorough argument and an organized argument to get us to understand what he's talking about, I know halfway through the book, I really was like, am I ever going to understand what he's really trying to get at? Because I was definitely struggling there. But because of how well he does this organization, because he's not getting lost in rhetorical flourishes as he writes, by the end of the book, even if you don't completely understand it, and I will not argue that I completely understand Owen Barfield, I certainly do not, but I can start to understand at least somewhat the idea that he is trying to get at, and that gives and that is a credit to his ability as an academic, as someone who can put together an organized argument. And so that's a huge strength of the book, that even though it is difficult to understand, that you can begin to understand it because he's laid it out bit by bit by bit, creating these building blocks for you to get to his final conclusion, or his final participation. I know, that was a good pun. So what are the weaknesses? Well, the weaknesses is the fact that you're probably looking at me going, Brice, what the hell have you been talking about? This is a complex book. It is a very difficult book, and Barfield really does exist outside the mainstream of Christian thought. He and Charles Williams both, in a lot of ways, are kind of the opposite ends of the spectrum here in the Inklings. Williams has very complex prose, but with pretty simple ideas. And they're ideas that, if you or even just a little bit familiar with some medieval ideas of courtly love and knightly adventures and things like that, it will sound, you will somehow find a way to understand him. Barfield's ideas do not have any relation to anything that we are familiar with. If you want to understand what he's talking about better, he was a big proponent of what was called anthroposophy. It's a sect of Christianity created by a guy named Rudolf Steiner. And so if you're interested in a little bit more of what this realm of Christian thought is, that's the area to go look at. And so that really adds to the difficulty. There's not, as much as Barfield's creating an organized argument, we don't have a lot of protocols here to, anchor ourselves to for some familiarity as we go through. His ideas are just very complex. At one point, maybe a couple points, he alludes to the idea of reincarnation, which is something that Barfield did believe in. He doesn't focus on it in this book, but again, he is very different from the mainstream of Christian thought. So it makes it harder to understand because he's not necessarily talking in common language or common images that we are familiar with. So, how do I rank the book? Well, this is a tough one. A part of me wants to rank it with a 3 out of 5 because I've struggled to understand fully what he means. The other part of me wants to rank it as a 4.5 out of 5 stars for the sheer originality of thought, for the incredibly well laid out argument. And so I think at the end of the day, I'm going to give it, just go right in between them. It's a 3.7 out of 5. 3.75 out of 5. And so I don't think I'm going higher than that for a final judgment. The book is absolutely worthwhile reading if you're trying to read through the Inklings, if you're trying to read through Owen Barfield's fiction works, if you want a better idea of what Owen Barfield means, if you want a better idea of the general conversation the Inklings were having with each other, this is a book that you definitely need to spend some time with and battle through and get through the end, because it is an original idea that is worth thinking about even if you disagree with it. So 3.75 out of 5. So what's coming up next? Well, next month here on the Inkling Review, we're going to keep continuing our look at the theological works of the Inklings by looking at C.S. Lewis's masterpiece of lay theology, Mere Christianity. But of course, we've got great content coming at you every Sunday here on the channel. Next week will be our next episode of 1,000 Words or Less, so don't forget to come back next week and check that great conversation out. And don't forget to like and subscribe and keep up with us every week here on the channel. All right, everybody, y'all have a great day, and we'll talk to you again soon.